Today, I'll be talking about the shape of meaning and how experiences of awe relate to autistic well-being. Awe is one of the ways human beings encounter meaning in the world. And understanding how awe appears in autistic experience may open new ways of thinking about well-being. Here is the arc for today's talk. We'll begin with meaning, then the science of awe, how autism deepens that science, my research findings, and what all this means for access and well-being. That's our path. Let's start with the first part. Why meaning before happiness? I first got introduced to the science of positive emotions during a talk by Professor Dacre Keltner at my undergraduate orientation at UC Berkeley. Later, I had the chance to interview him for the Daily Californian, where he reflects on what it means to live a meaningful life. In that conversation, happiness isn't defined as constant pleasure or emotional comfort. Instead, it's framed as something deeper, something rooted in how we make sense of our lives. Purpose gives shape to experience. It allows people to endure difficulty without reducing their lives to that difficulty. Importantly, purpose doesn't require that life feel good all the time, it requires that life feel intelligible. That distinction matters deeply when we think about neurodivergence, disability, and lives lived under constraint. Connection, in this framing, isn't just social closeness. It's connection to ideas, to values, to the world beyond the self. It's about belonging, in a broader sense. This understanding of happiness as meaning, purpose, and connection opens the door to emotions that don't always feel pleasant, but that still profoundly support well-being. I went on to taking his class on human happiness. What struck me immediately was how emotions weren't treated as isolated mental states. They were situated within culture, evolution, morality, and society. We talked about neuroscience and psychology, but also philosophy, history, and art. Happiness wasn't reduced to a score or a metric. It was treated as a lived, embodied phenomenon. That framing resonated deeply with me, especially as someone interested in how people make meaning under constraint. Crucially, the course made room for lived experience, not just theory. Emotions were discussed as things people navigate, not just things they possess. The International Day of Happiness is a day set aside globally to reflect on what it means to live a good life. On the surface, it sounds simple and universally appealing. Who wouldn't want happiness? Happiness is universal in theory. It is often discussed in terms of well-being indices, productivity, life satisfaction scores, or emotional positivity. These frameworks tend to assume a certain kind of life, one with relative stability, access, and predictability. But, for many people, those assumptions don't hold. And when they don't, happiness can start to feel like a moving target, or even a moral expectation, rather than a lived experience. For disabled people, happiness is often discussed without them in the room. Happiness and well-being appear in autism discourse as problems to be solved. Well-being itself is framed as something that comes after progress, after intervention, after independence. This is especially the case for autistics with complex support needs. That framing quietly defers flourishing. What's often missing is the qualitative texture of experience. How happiness is felt, accessed, and sustained in real life. So, before we talk about happiness, we need to ask, whose happiness are we even talking about? Many autistics spend years waiting on wait lists, waiting for services or evaluations that are framed as prerequisites for well-being. Access to care itself is often tied to cost, insurance, geography, or gatekeeping. Well-being becomes something you have to earn, not something you earn now. The message is clear. Happiness comes after enough progress and compliance. This framing makes flourishing conditional rather than human. Studying positive emotions is often misunderstood as toxic positivity. But it's not a denial of hardship, ignoring pain, or insisting that people feel good. Positive emotions function as psychological resources. They help people orient, adapt, and recover, especially when circumstances are difficult. This matters most for lives shaped by constraint. When hardship is ongoing, psychological resources aren't luxuries, they're necessities. Out of all the emotions we discussed in class, one kept pulling me back. Awe. It was energizing. But it also felt expansive inside me. It made me pause and look again. Why awe, and why now? We're living through rapid technological, social, and environmental change. The pace of information alone is staggering. Many of the assumptions that may once have helped us navigate daily life no longer hold steady. When the world moves faster than our understanding can update, cognitive load increases. People feel stretched, uncertain, and disoriented. That stretching, that moment when something exceeds what we expect, is exactly where awe tends to appear. So awe isn't just poetic. It's relevant. It speaks to how humans reorganize themselves when the world feels larger or more complex than before. And right now, that feeling is common. Now that we've grounded happiness in meaning, we can turn to awe itself. How researchers define it. At its core, awe begins with vastness. That vastness can be physical, like towering redwoods, or the night sky. But it can also be conceptual. A powerful idea. A moral act. A system that suddenly makes sense. Vastness simply means something larger than our current frame of understanding. The second component is what makes awe different. When we encounter vastness, our existing mental models aren't enough. The mind has to adjust. It has to stretch. It has to reorganize. Awe isn't just admiration. It's cognitive updating. That's why awe feels like a pause. The world exceeds the model, and the model has to change. We've already talked about two core components of awe, vastness, and the need for accommodation. From there, researchers have identified additional dimensions that often accompany this process. A third dimension is altered time perception. Many people report that time feels different during awe. It may slow down. It may feel suspended. That shift creates space, a moment outside the usual rush of experience. Fourth is self-loss. The boundaries of the self soften. You feel smaller, not diminished, but positioned within something larger. A fifth dimension is connectedness. There's often a sense of connection to nature, to ideas, to humanity, or to something transcendent. And importantly, this isn't always social. It can be conceptual or existential. The last dimension is physiological sensations. People often describe chills, goosebumps, warmth, or shifts in breathing. Awe is embodied, as well as cognitive. So when we step back, awe isn't just a pleasant feeling. It's a structural experience that reorganizes how the self relates to the world. In many studies, awe is associated with inspiration, connection, and prosociality. This is the version of awe most people are familiar with. It feels expansive and uplifting. But awe can also feel overwhelming or threatening, especially when vastness comes without clarity or control. This form of awe is often under-discussed, even though it's theoretically central. Many real-world awe experiences contain both. They are beautiful and unsettling at the same time. This mixed valence is not a flaw, it's a feature of awe, as a recalibration emotion. Why is awe linked to well-being? Awe helps people situate experience within a broader frame. It supports adaptation, rather than avoidance. Awe does not change difficulty, it changes how difficulty is held. Once we understand awe, structurally, a new question naturally emerges. What happens when we look at awe through autistic experience? Autism doesn't sit outside this story. It helps us see parts of it with more clarity. The popular story of awe is that it elevates us, connects us, and makes us more pro-social. In many studies, awe appears as a deeply positive emotion, one that expands perspective and increases well-being. And that story is real. But awe is also layered. To fully understand it, we have to look not only at its benefits, but also how it unfolds in different lives. Autism offers a powerful lens. Autism sharpens questions of perception, how the world is sensed and organized. It often involves deep attention, intensity, and structured meaning systems. Because of that, autism doesn't challenge the science of awe, it clarifies it. It allows us to see how awe is organized in a different, but equally meaningful way. That gap is where my research begins. After learning the science of awe, questions naturally emerged. How is awe organized in autistic adults? What does it feel like? And what does it mean in daily life? Not as a deficit question, not as a pathology question, but as a structural question. That curiosity is where my research begins. This leads us to my research. As a Berkeley Haas scholar, I got to do a year-long, fully funded research on the emotion of awe. I was mentored by the awesome Professor Dacre Keltner. For a pun on words, it was quite simply awesome to research awe with an expert on awe. A preprint of the research is available online. And it was rather cool to be quoted in an Nat Geo article on awe. Our study made use of 100 autistics and 100 neurotypicals matched for age and education level. First, we looked at trait awe, meaning how likely someone is, in general, to experience awe. There was no meaningful difference between autistics and neurotypicals. So this isn't a story about autistics being less awe-prone. The differences show up in how awe unfolds in the moment. That's important. When we compared autistics and neurotypicals on the dimensions of awe, we found differences were specific, not global. One of the clearest differences was physiological sensations. Non-autistic participants were more likely to report chills, goosebumps, or a physical rush during awe. Autistic participants reported fewer of these bodily sensations. One possible context for interpreting this pattern comes from autism research on interoception and alexithymia. One possible piece of context is interoception. Interoception is the system that allows us to sense internal body signals, things like heart rate, breathing, stomach sensations, bladder signals, or skin temperature. Past research suggests that for many autistic people these signals can be too strong, too faint, or inconsistent. So the challenge can occur at the very first step, simply noticing that a bodily change is happening at all. A related concept is alexithymia, which refers to difficulty identifying and describing emotions. Here the bodily signal may be sensed, but the challenge is interpreting what it means emotionally. For example, your heart might start racing after exercise or excitement, which are generally positive experiences. But the same racing heartbeat can also happen with anxiety, fear, or stress. If those signals are difficult to interpret, you may simply notice that your heart is pounding, without a clear sense of whether it reflects excitement or distress. The experience may simply register as something feels different, without a clear emotional label. One way to think about the distinction is like this. Interoception is about sensing the signal, while alexithymia is about interpreting what that signal means emotionally. Now coming back to our results. Interestingly, autistic participants also reported greater alterations in time perception during an awe experience. Moments were more likely to feel slowed down or stretched out. The experience lingered. One possible interpretation is that, if awe is reported less through strong bodily sensations, it may instead be experienced more through shifts in attention and perception. So the differences weren't global. The differences were specific in how the experience showed up. For neurotypicals, awe tended to show up more in the body. For autistics, awe tended to unfold more in the way time felt. We also looked at broader personality traits to understand the context in which awe experiences occur. These analyses also accounted for socioeconomic background. Let's start with openness. Awe is often linked to openness, curiosity, imagination, and appreciation of ideas. Autistic participants in our study actually scored higher on openness. That challenges common stereotypes. Next is neuroticism, a trait associated with stress sensitivity and emotional reactivity. Neuroticism was higher in the autistic group, consistent with broader autism research. And yet awe was still present and meaningful. It did not disappear under stress. It did not require emotional calm. Then there's extroversion, being outwardly social. Autistic participants were less extroverted, again reflecting broader findings. And yet their overall tendency to experience awe was similar. Awe does not require being highly outgoing. And finally, conscientiousness, which reflect tendencies toward organization and self-management. Autistic participants reported lower conscientiousness. So awe does not depend on being highly structured or orderly. It appears across different ways of navigating daily life. When we looked at what evokes awe across both groups, the strongest shared elicitor was nature. Mountains, forests, the ocean, vast landscapes. Nature was the common ground. After nature, the pattern begins to diverge. Certain themes emerged. In autistic narratives there was more frequent mention of conceptual and abstract themes. Social and collective themes were present, but mentioned less often. In neurotypical narratives, social and collective experiences were mentioned more frequently. Conceptual and abstract awe was absolutely present, just at lower rates. To quote this autistic participant, "The universe, multiverse, solar system and beyond, whatever I'm supposed to call it, is so ridiculously dense to begin with. So for me to try to picture everything, down to the individual subatomic particles, having a strand of the mental web image of the timeline in my mind, makes me absolutely in awe of the density of existence." Notice how their experience of awe is anchored in structure, in scale, in conceptual density. It leans towards ideas, knowledge, and systems. These are quotes from some neurotypical participants. One said, "I was thrilled to be at the concert and my best friend went with me." A second quote, "How everyone took notes and watched the lecture differently." A third quote, "I feel awe when I see my friend do her physics assignments." And a fourth, "Attending an arts exhibit with friends." Notice how awe is frequently embedded in shared or social contexts. A concert with a friend. Watching how people learn differently in a lecture. Seeing someone you admire solve a difficult problem. Visiting an art exhibit together. In these examples, the awe experience is not just about the stimulus itself. It's closely tied to relationships, shared moments, and collective experience. Let's look at other awe elicitors. Both groups mentioned music, visual design, personal milestones, art, and performance. So this is not about who can experience what. It's about which themes appeared more often in storytelling. So far, we've been talking about what evokes awe. Looking through the narratives, I also noticed something interesting. These are not statistically significant results, but just my observation. What was interesting was how awe itself was described. Not the stimulus itself, but the texture of the description. As an autistic, I could totally relate to the sensory nature of some of these narratives. This is a quote from an autistic participant. "I put my feet in the water, and feel the sensation of water climbing up my feet and leaving. The cool breeze also touches my face, and I feel great." In some of the autistic narratives, awe was described through perception and sensory detail, like the example of the sensation of water on the feet. The experience is tracked through what was seen, felt, and physically sensed. Let's look at a neurotypical example. This one says, "I was amazed whenever I looked out the window. It was so expansive and beautiful." So, in contrast, many neurotypical responses tended to summarize the emotional impact, using phrases like amazed or inspired. Both groups clearly experienced awe. This isn't a difference in emotional depth. It appears to be more about differences in descriptive style, how the experience is narrated. In this project, we asked a simple but serious question. Can awe be a tool in the autistic coping toolbox? Can it function as a coping resource in autistic lives? Not as inspiration, not as sentiment, but as something structurally useful. Let's look at a few examples. These are illustrative examples from the narratives, showing how some participants described their experiences. Quoting one autistic participant, "Both big and small, awe for me is a solitary experience. Having other people around clouds it for me, and I can't get lost in it the way I want to." In this example, the participant described awe as a quiet, internally framed experience. Not necessarily outward excitement or dramatic emotion, but a kind of calm immersion. Here, awe is not about performance or outward expression. It's about being absorbed in the moment, where the environment becomes the focus and internal tension quiets down. In this sense, awe appears to function as a form of internal regulation. Here is another example quote. "I feel a recalibration, this is what really matters, and it's bigger than me or any of us." In our research, this experience is sometimes described as the small self effect, where attention shifts away from the individual and toward something larger. What's striking here is that the experience doesn't erase the self. Instead, it places the self within a larger context. Problems that once felt overwhelming can begin to feel differently sized. Let's look at more examples. The first quote says, "It creates moments where I can't, or don't have to live in my thoughts as much, so it helps with my anxiety a lot." This example described awe as a kind of relief from mental pressure. For people who experience persistent rumination or intrusive thoughts, awe may briefly interrupt that loop. Attention shifts outward, toward something vast or absorbing, and in that moment the mind may step outside the same cycle of thoughts. Now let's see the second quote. It says, "Does not fault me for not doing the right things, or not providing an appropriate answer fast enough." This quote points to a slightly different kind of relief. Here the relief is not just cognitive, it is social. In moments of awe, the environment itself becomes absorbing enough that the pressure to perform, respond, or explain oneself temporarily fades. These examples suggest that for some participants, awe may provide brief moments where both mental loops and social pressure loosen. Finally, other narratives describe awe as something people actively return to during difficult times. The quotes read, "It gives me a break, which helps me process things. Experiences of awe also help me stay grounded when I am having a hard time." Here awe becomes more than an emotion. It may function almost like a coping resource, something that participants describe as helping restore balance when the mind or body feels overwhelmed. In that sense, awe may not just be a moment of wonder. For some, it may become a tool people use for emotional stability. Interestingly, this pattern also aligns with broader awe research. Some studies suggest that awe may engage parasympathetic processes, including vagal activity, which are associated with calm and physiological regulation. While our study did not measure physiology, the narratives participants shared point in a similar experiential direction. In today's talk, I could only highlight a few of the findings and observations that felt most illustrative. But what we've seen suggests that awe may be an important resource in autistic lives. If awe is real, and if it matters for meaning and well-being, then the next question becomes practical. Who has access to it? What conditions support it? And how do we make sure it isn't reserved for the privileged few? This is where awe becomes a democratic question. Awe isn't just about feeling better. It isn't just a mood boost or a pleasant emotional spike. Instead, awe helps us orient. It gives us a way to stand in relation to something larger, rather than escape from what's difficult. And importantly, awe allows us to hold complexity. It makes space for beauty and uncertainty, expansion and humility, all at once. Awe isn't just about mood. It's about meaning. Awe doesn't disappear under constraint, it changes form. Awe does not disappear in autistic lives. It shows up, sometimes differently, but it shows up. The conditions of disability may shift how awe feels, but they don't erase it. Under chronic stress, awe may become briefer, more fragile, or more interior, but it still matters. And in caregiving, awe can coexist with exhaustion. It can be found in small recognitions, not grand gestures. Awe doesn't vanish under pressure. It changes form. If awe is about meaning, then everyone can access it. But the pathway won't look the same for everyone. Some people find awe in nature, others in ideas, systems, art, or quiet detail. There is no single, correct trigger, no hierarchy of what counts. Awe belongs to everyone, just not in the same way. Awe is low cost. It does not require special tools or expensive retreats. It does not require emotional expertise or psychological readiness. And it does not require a particular body or mind. Awe can arise in ordinary moments, quietly and accessibly. Awe does not require wilderness. It can arise while standing between tall buildings, feeling scale in architecture and sky. It can emerge in light reflecting off glass or the rhythm of movement in a city. And for some, awe is easier at a distance, observing without being immersed. Urban spaces hold awe too. Awe does not always announce itself loudly. It can live in a single leaf, in the structure of an object, in the symmetry of a pattern. Repetition itself can be awe-inviting, watching something unfold with precision and order. Sometimes awe arrives in small doses, and small is enough. For many autistics, special interests are not escapes from the world. They are ways of engaging it deeply. They allow mastery, and mastery often reveals beauty in structure and detail. That beauty becomes meaning. Awe doesn't need a productivity plan. It might come during a short walk, taken at a sensory pace, rather than a fitness pace. Awe does not need a goal to be valid. Awe is powerful, but it should never become another expectation or requirement. It should not be framed as something people must cultivate in order to be considered well. And it should never be used to gloss over real struggle or systemic barriers. Well-being works best when it is supported, not mandated. You don't need to manufacture awe. You can simply allow it. For families, This might mean permission for experiences to look different. It might mean slowness, allowing moments to unfold without rushing toward correction. And it means noticing small moments of engagement that already carry meaning. For clinicians and systems, this means reducing unnecessary gatekeeping around access to life. It means designing environments that invite curiosity and reflection, not just compliance. And it means recognizing that well-being should not be postponed until after progress. Well-being belongs in the present. Well-being is also an infrastructure issue. Public access to parks, libraries, museums, and safe urban spaces creates opportunities for awe. Urban design can either compress or expand experience. Low-cost well-being strategies matter because access should not depend on privilege. For autistics, you do not need to earn meaning. Awe may already be happening in your life, in depth, in focus, in systems, in detail. And the way you experience it counts. It does not need to resemble anyone else's version. Your experience of awe is already valid. If we value meaning over optimization, well-being changes shape. If we prioritize access over achievement, more lives belong in the story of happiness. And if we allow awe to exist on human terms, varied, imperfect, real, then we stop asking people to earn their place in it. What we are really creating is room. Meaning gives us room to move.